Hello, and thanks for joining us today as we continue in our study in the book of Isaiah. Today, in our workbook lesson, we are looking at lesson 13, which is covering Isaiah chapters 45 through 48. At this particular point, God is trying to now give comfort to the Jews to help them understand that, yes, they are going to go through a savage punishment for all of their iniquity and sin. But because of that transgression, the chastisement would last only for about 70 years, and then because they served a loving, benevolent God, he was going to do what was nothing short of a miraculous thing. He was going to allow a defeated people that was moved away from their homeland into captivity in a far-off locality to once again be granted their freedom and independence and allowed to go back home and to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and the temple where they worshiped God. All of this would have been unheard of in the practices of the ancient civilizations. And so God is making the point to the Jews that while God's punishment was going to be severe, it was something that had to be done to help them understand the seriousness of sin. We find as we got to the end of Isaiah 44, that God even names the king of the Persians, who was going to be the instrument that would allow them to come back home. Here is a prophecy naming Cyrus as the king who would allow this to happen, and this prophecy is being spoken some 150 to 200 years in advance. Cyrus wasn't even born yet. The Babylonian Empire had not reached its zenith. It had not come yet and taken the city of Jerusalem. All of these things were being given in advance to prove that God is in control in the affairs of men. We find, looking at question 1 in this particular workbook lesson, it says, write a short summary of Isaiah chapter 45. Whenever we look at the outset of the chapter, it says, thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. And I will loose the loins of kings, to open up before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. And I will go before thee, and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass, and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which called thee by thy name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and for Israel my elect's sake, I have even called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. We find that as we look to a summary of the things that he goes on to say in this chapter, God is saying that Cyrus, who would be the king of the Persian Empire, would be the instrument of deliverance of the nation of Jews. And through them, they would be able to return to their homeland. Now, Cyrus was not going to be an adamant, faithful admirer of God. In fact, as all of these events unfold, he may have a difficulty even acknowledging the God that the Jews worshiped. But evidence is being given here by this prophetic prophecy in advance that this will certainly be a sign that God is at work. In the next question, question 2, it says, write a short summary of chapter 46. Well, whenever we start looking at this short chapter in chapter 46, here we find that God is showing that these pagan gods that these nations worship are no match for him. He said, Bel boweth down, Nebo stoopeth. Their idols were upon the beasts and upon the cattle. Your carriages were heavy laden, and they are a burden to the weary beast. They stoop, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but themselves are gone into captivity. The point that he begins to make here is that Nebo and Bel and other of the gods that were going to be popularly worshipped throughout this region by the pagan nations, they couldn't even transport themselves from one place to another. They had to be loaded upon beasts of burden and carted from one place to another. And he goes on in this chapter to talk about what he said is going to happen and how in evidence it will come to pass. God is greater than these Babylonian gods, and he will do what he has promised. That's the whole point of what Isaiah is making in this next chapter. In verses 12 and 13 of the 46th chapter, he said, "Hearken unto me, you stout-hearted, and they that are far from righteousness. I bring near my righteousness, it shall not be far off, and my salvation shall not tarry. I will place salvation in Zion, for Israel my glory." God said, I'm going to be the one to take care of things. I am the God who is in control. These idols that these various nations worship indeed were nothing. And while those pagan nations might want to give lip service and credit to their idols for them being victorious, the truth was, as Isaiah stated it, and as Israel would recognize, the true force and power was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In question 3, he said, write a short summary of chapter 47. Whenever the Israelites are carried away into captivity, carried away from their homeland, lose everything that they have, they are totally distraught. They are a defeated people. They are now a nation of captives. And Babylon continues to dwell or to grow for many years in power and preeminence. We can think of the story of Daniel, how that Nebuchadnezzar brought in the wisest of all of the nations that they conquered, and there was a great search for knowledge. One of the wonders of the ancient world was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar on occasion boasted of the great nation that he had created. When he had the dream of the image and the succeeding empires that would come, it was the Babylonian kingdom that was the head of gold. But when their iniquity was full, when they trusted in themselves, when they became so arrogant that there was no recognition of God and the feeling that they were invincible, God was going to destroy the great Babylonian empire. God was going to cause Babylon to fall, and they would have arrogantly trusted in themselves. They would have never thought that could have happened, but God will bring them down, and it was going to amaze both the Babylonians and all the rest of the world, because Babylon had been such an efficient government, such a powerful government, such an arrogant and sinful government, that many felt there was nothing that could displace them, nothing that could destroy them. But the great God of heaven proved differently. In question 4, it says, write a short summary of chapter 48. Now in chapter 48, God is going to make the point that Israel needed deliverance from their bondage, but because they had brought it on themselves. He goes back and reminds them that it was because of their sins and their transgressions that they wound up in this bondage in the first place. And God foretold step by step all that was going to happen so that there would not be even the temptation to give any credit to idols of any sort for saying that this is what had caused these events to unfold. He says in verse 1 of the 48th chapter, hear ye this, O house of Jacob, which are called by the name of Israel, and are come forth out of the waters of Judah, which swear by the name of the Lord, and make mention of the God of Israel, but not in truth nor in righteousness. For they call themselves of the holy city, and stay themselves upon the God of Israel. The Lord of hosts is his name. I have declared the former things from the beginning, and they went forth out of my mouth. And I showed them. I did them suddenly, and they came to pass. Because I knew that thou art obstinate, and thy neck is as an iron sinew, and thy brow brass. I've even from the beginning declared it to thee. Before it came to pass, I showed it thee, lest thou shouldest say, mine idol hath done them, and my graven image, and my molten image hath commanded them. Thou hast heard, and see all this, and will ye not declare it? I have showed thee new things from the time, even hidden things, that thou didst not know them. They are created now, and not from the beginning, even before the day when thou heardest them not. Lest thou shouldest say, behold, I knew them. Yea, thou heardest not, yea, thou knewest not, yea, from the time that thine ear was not opened, I knew that thou wouldest deal very treacherously, and was called a transgressor from the womb. For my name's sake I will defer mine anger, and for my praise will I refrain from thee, that I cut thee not off. Behold, I have refined thee, but not with silver. I have chosen thee in the furnace of affliction. For mine own sake, even for mine own sake will I do it. For how should my name be polluted, and I will not be given my glory unto another? Hearken unto me, O Jacob and Israel, my called. I am he. I am the first, I am also the last. Mine hand hath also laid the foundation of the earth, and my right hand hath spanned the heavens. When I call unto them, they stand up together. All ye, assemble yourselves, and hear, which among them hath declared these things. The Lord hath loved him. He will do his pleasure on Babylon, and his arm shall be on the Chaldeans. I, even I, have spoken. Yea, I have called him, I have brought him, and he shall make his way prosperous. Come ye near unto me. Hear ye this. I've not spoken it in secret from the beginning, from the time that it was. There am I. And now the Lord God and his Spirit hath sent me. Thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am the Lord thy God, which teacheth thee to profit, which leadeth thee by the way that thou shouldest go. O that thou hadst hearkened to my commandments! Then had thy peace been as a river, and thy righteousness as the waves of the sea. Thy seed also have been as the sand, and the offspring of thy bowels like the gravel thereof. His name should not have been cut off, nor destroyed from before me. Go ye forth of Babylon, flee ye from the Chaldeans. With a voice of singing declare ye, tell this, utter it even to the ends of the earth. Ye say, the Lord hath redeemed his servant Jacob, and hath thirsted not when he led them through the deserts. He caused the waters to flow out of the rock for them. He clave the rock also, and the waters gushed out. There is no peace, saith the Lord, unto the wicked. So Isaiah makes the point here very clearly to Israel, that they are going to go through affliction, and they are going to suffer much, but that God was in control. He would take care of eliminating Babylon when the time was right, and he would use the Assyrians to crush the Babylonians, and through all of this, the Jews would survive. They would get to go back to their homeland, and they would once again be allowed to prosper. So all of it is being laid out here, so that Israel could see the path, and could understand through its prophecies what was going to come to pass. That there should be no misunderstanding that God was the one who was working all of these wondrous things to come to pass. In question 5, he says, what impact would the overthrow of Babylon have on the other nations? In chapter 45, going back to verses 20 through 25, we find that the other nations are going to be absolutely dumbfounded that God is going to do such wondrous things. He says, assemble yourselves and come, draw nigh together, ye that are escaped of the nations, that have no knowledge, that set up the wood of their graven image, and pray unto a God that cannot save. Tell ye and bring them near, yea, let them take counsel together. Who hath declared this from ancient time? Who hath told it from that time? Have not I, the Lord? And there is no God else besides me, a just God and a Savior. There is none beside me. Look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth. For I am God, and there is none else. I have sworn by myself, the word is gone out of my mouth, in righteousness, and shall not return, that unto me every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall swear. Surely shall one say, in the Lord have I righteousness and strength. Even to him shall men come, and all that are incensed against him shall be ashamed. In the Lord shall all the seed of Israel be justified, and shall glory. The point is being made here that God is the one who will control his plans and how things are going to work out. He is going to be the one to teach all nations that he takes care of his people, his will is going to be obeyed, and that he was going to be the author of all good things. But these idols that many of the nations had turned to, they were absolutely worthless. But all would see that only Jehovah was the true God. In question 6, he says, what is the contrast drawn in chapter 46 between God and the idols? Well, as we noticed in those first two verses, when we read it a while ago, he says, Baal bowed down, and Nebo stoopeth. Their idols were upon the beasts and upon the cattle. Your carriages were heavy laden. They are a burden to the weary beast. They stoop, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but themselves are gone into captivity. The point that he's making is that God can and will do what he plans, but as far as the idols are concerned, they are built by man, they are carried by man, they are served by man according to man's own wisdom, but in reality, it's all a deception, because those idols are absolutely worthless. In Isaiah chapter 45, verses 9 through 13, the author asks, in what ways do many question God today? Well, there are many today who question, as they look at the suffering on the earth and look at adverse things that occur, is God even still up there? Is God still alive? Is he in control? And for many individuals, they basically have written him off, that man's in control. Man is the one running everything. But they don't know how God accomplishes what he does. They don't know when he is going to choose to move or why he allows things to happen as he does. Only God knows his grand plan as to how the events are going to evolve on this planet. But we, just like these mistaken pagans, want to create gods. Sometimes it's the God of secular humanism, it's the God of wisdom and knowledge, but we worship all that we know, and we think that we have a better understanding of God's plan, and that really it's just the plan of man, and that we control all of these things. How mistaken we are. We find in question 8, he said, what nations would seek to identify themselves with Israel, and why would they do that? In chapter 45, and going down to verse 14, it says, thus saith the Lord, the labor of Egypt, the merchandise of Ethiopia, and of the Sabaeans, men of stature shall come over unto thee, and they shall be thine, and they shall come after thee. In chains they shall come over, and they shall fall down unto thee. They shall make supplication unto thee, saying, surely God is in thee, and there is none else. There is no God. He's talking here about the nation of Egypt and of Ethiopia, and he's also talking about the Sabaeans, which were one of the powerful tribes in Arabia. The Sabaeans are mentioned in Job chapter 1 and verse 15. They were the ones who came and stole a bunch of the wealth that Job had. Other prophecies as well make mention of the Sabaeans as they dwell in the wilderness of Arabia. But they were going to recognize the way in which God continually took care of his people. That God allowed them to be overtaken, but then he also allowed them to return back home. And they are going to be impressed with the power of the God that the Israelites worship, because their gods have not been able to sustain them and to protect them in any such sort of way. In question 9, it says, how was Babylon viewed before she fell to Persia? Well, that's outlined a lot in chapter 47. She's referred to as the Lady of the Kingdoms. Whenever Babylon was ascending as a power, they did accumulate the wisdom of all of the nations that they overthrew. That's what took Daniel from Jerusalem to Babylon. He and others who were the wise and up-and-coming young men of the kingdom, they came to study and to share the knowledge that they had. Babylon had effective government. Babylon had a system of literacy. Babylon had a way of communicating. Babylon was a powerful military force. They were the envy of the known world at that time because they built a good, solid foundation. But then as they prospered, their prospering, shall we say, went to their head, and they became excessively corrupt. They began to worship all of their wisdom and knowledge. They began to do as they wanted to do, and there was no respect given to the great God of heaven. Daniel warned Nebuchadnezzar that that was going to happen and there would be punishment for it, and he was there. The night that the hand wrote on the wall and helped Belshazzar understand that God had now weighed the kingdom, found it wanting, and he gave it over to the Persians. We find in question 9, how was Babylon viewed? Well, let's go to question 10. How was Babylon viewed after she fell to Persia? Well, she was utterly destroyed, and people were amazed at the completeness of her destruction. Over in Isaiah 47, and going down to verse 14, behold, they shall be as stubble, and fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before it. Whenever Babylon was destroyed, it was destroyed and left as a heap. Even looking back over to the years that have followed, you did not see the resurrection of the city of Babylon. God completely ground it to dust. Even there was not refuge there for an animal to come and to find shelter. It was completely obliterated and destroyed. It says in question 11, how does Isaiah 47:3, which equates exposing the thigh to nakedness, relate to New Testament passages on modesty? Well, as it's talked about here in Isaiah 47 and going down to verse 3, it said, thy nakedness shall be uncovered, yea, thy shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man. The whole point was they were going to appear as destitute. They were not going to be able to dress in the finery that they had in the past. They were going to be left exposed and improperly clothed because they simply had all of their wealth, shall we say, stripped away from them. There's nothing here about them somehow being glamorous and sexy and the beautiful outfits that they maybe had worn in former days. Modesty teaches us to understand the importance of proper attire and what that says about a person. And the Babylonians were going to tell two different stories. On the one hand, they were the arrogant fashion models of the world, blessed with wealth and affluence. But by the time God was done with them, they were dressed in the rags of destitution. They were not even modestly clothed, in that they had lost everything because of their iniquity. So it's important that we understand the appropriateness of dress as the scriptures teach it, and strive to abide by those principles. And then finally, in question 12, for class discussion, in what ways are we today like Israel, who brought her problems on herself? Well, our nation is going down much the same path. That we bring on many of the problems that we are encountering because we've forgotten about the worship of God. Instead, we are following a doctrine of secular humanism, that it's all about us and our knowledge and what we have learned and what we have accomplished, without giving proper respect and honor to the God that made all of this possible. And whenever we shut out God in our thinking, choose not to retain him in our knowledge, Romans chapter 1 teaches us what happens whenever people choose to not retain God in their knowledge, and all the iniquity that just multiplies itself. All of those abominations that are worthy of destruction. Unless the nation repents, unless we strive to reconnect with our God as we should, it's an obvious fact from all this history that we're reading that eventually God's patience will run out even with this great nation, and things will change dramatically. So it's important that we understand that through whatever the tempests of political upheaval may surround us, the wars that may be fought, the difficulties that may be encountered, our job is to keep our focus on God. If there could have been 10 righteous souls found in Sodom, that city would have been spared. The only continuing problem or virtue that helps this nation continue, I believe, are those that are concerned about doing that which is right. And we pray that we'll be able to reach more and more people with that and sway the opinions of people, that we can once again return to God and have a fear of him and a willingness to obey his ways. So here we find that Isaiah is helping Israel to understand that they're going to go through this tremendous amount of turmoil, but then eventually God was going to send a Savior, and that came in the form of Jesus Christ. And a comfort would be given, and through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And so the nation of Israel, the people of Judah, were going to get to go home. God was going to preserve them until the time was right for the Messiah to come. And then when his word began to spread, it would spread all over the world, so that all men everywhere could have remission of sins and become part of the family of God if they would be obedient to the things that God had commanded. So Isaiah here is helping us to look on down the road, that there were some tough times ahead, but that God had not forsaken his people. And even though it would appear that the Babylonians were the immediate threat, that God even had a plan that went beyond that. It was the plan of the day that the Assyrians would destroy the Babylonians. But through all of that, Israel would get to come home, and eventually, through their lineage and through their descendants, the Messiah would be born. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this study of these chapters in the book of Isaiah today, and we hope that you'll be with us next week as we continue in pressing on in this study. Thank you for joining us.